Thank you, Madam President, for the incredible honor to debate in this historic chamber tonight on a topic which is now more relevant than ever. My speech will center around three arguments. I will first talk about the horrific bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and go into historical detail on whether the bombings directly influenced Japan's surrender, the various arguments surrounding the lives lost and the lives supposedly spared, and finally the opinions of those directly involved with the decision of dropping the two bombs. I will next move on to the devastating historic impact that both nuclear bombings and nuclear incidents have had on the nature that surrounds us, and why that is exceptionally important now. And I will finally wrap up with why a nuclear war would be more devastating now than ever before, with reasons ranging from bomb development to the vast network of ready-to-fire warheads that surround us all. But before we dirty our hands with business, it is my duty and very much my honor to introduce the speakers on the proposition side. You've just heard from Chris Collins, a fourth-year classics student at Corpus Christi College. His Roman Empire-influenced delusions of grandeur have served him well, both within his college JCR and within our very own union. And it's relieving to see that they carry into his speech today. Absolute power is apparently within reach, and in the form of a red button, no less. Next, you will hear from Trisha Purnaya, a second-year human scientist at St. John's College. Now, in my lengthy preparation for this speech, I desperately searched for something to poke fun at about Trisha. But apart from the occasional cheesy LinkedIn post and her slight electoral malpractice mishap, we'll just gloss over that, I came up with only wholesome stuff. But this is why I'm genuinely surprised and a little scared that she's on side proposition tonight. And finally, you will hear from Devin Darley, a second-year biomed student at New College. Devin is proudly American, which among many things might explain his affinity towards weapons. And whereas he will try to convince you that world leaders should press the red button tonight, that might prove to be a clash with the Hippocratic oath he hopes to take in the future. In his own words, he hopes to work towards a healthier, happier, and more equitable world, a positively admirable mission that, for some odd reason, has grown to include nuclear bombs. Madam President, these are your speakers, and they are most welcome. April 6, 1945, Hiroshima, Japan. Over 100,000 people killed. April 9th, 1945, Nagasaki, Japan. Around 75,000 people killed. Long-term effects include a nationwide spike in cancer, developmental and cognitive problems, and birth defects. We will never know the true death toll. The primary argument for the bombings of these two cities were, and will be, that they prevented further deaths by forcing Japan to surrender. And while that argument may sound reasonable, it has been proven to be optimistic at best and a propaganda lie at worst. A US post-war survey found in 1946 that Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, certainly prior to the end of 1945 and most likely prior to November of 1945. That is a direct quote. This would mean that if the atomic bombs did force Japan to surrender, they all but shortened the war by 3 months. And even this, yes.
Given that between tens and hundreds of thousands of Chinese and Japanese soldiers were dying monthly, is it not still the case that the bombs saved lives?
Thank you for introducing my next point. I will get to that in a second. And even this might not be true. Many historians now point to the Soviet invasion of Manchuria as the deciding factor in the Japanese surrender. At that point in time, Germany had already surrendered 3 months ago. The US had won decisive naval victories against the Imperial Navy. And the world was already expecting a full surrender from Japan. And this opinion is not exclusively shared among historians sitting in their comfy chairs more than 50 years down the line. Those who have deemed the bombings to be unnecessary include General Eisenhower, General MacArthur, Admiral Nimitz, and many more. Not now, in a second. Even President Truman said he didn't like the idea of killing a further 100,000 people, a chillingly calm response to such an important decision. But the response, nevertheless. Before I move on to my next point, I want to make one final note on the validity of the argument that the lives sacrificed during the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki spared many more. I think this is the point that will address your point. Simple statistics can show you that even if the Imperial Army continued killing at the rate with which they had at the height of their military offensive, such as the situation in China, a very bold assumption, the early surrender of Japan would have spared around 250,000 lives. Not now. This means that even at the very extreme end of assuming Japan's military ideals at the time, the bombs would all but break even in terms of human cost. April 26, 1986, Chernobyl, Ukrainian SSR. 10 tons of enriched radioactive fuel is directly propelled into the surrounding environment. March 11, 2011, Fukushima, Japan. 10,000 tons of highly contaminated water is released into the Pacific Ocean due to a containment failure, and has very recently now come to the news because apparently people are eating fish that was grown in that water. The Soviet Mayak plant creates an intense amount of radioactive pollution within Lake Karachay. The Manhattan Project tests permanently pollute the area surrounding the test sites. And yet tests continue, secretive developments are covered up with propaganda, and environmental impact is deemed a second priority. Now, though, we can no longer dismiss such damage to our planet with ease. As every generation is destined to suffer from the mistakes of the previous one, we are still slowly discovering the centuries-long effects of such nuclear activities. And in a potential all-out nuclear war, the environmental impact from both the direct blast and from the radiation left behind would be to such an extent that the world would become unrecognizably barren. It seems counterintuitive, foolish even, to discuss the reasons that may deem nuclear war necessary, when we are still yet to figure out how to deal with accidental nuclear damage, let alone intentional ones. Even the 1.5 billion euro containment building around Chernobyl will have to be replaced within the next century. The worldwide effort required to undo the damage from a modern nuclear conflict is therefore incredibly difficult to imagine. From widespread spikes in genetic mutation to irreversible damage to the entire food cycle, it is certain that the nature surrounding us would never recover. October 30th, 1961, Mityushika Bay, USSR. A 5-mile wide fireball dominates the sky. This is the result of the Tsar bomba testing, the most powerful nuclear warhead ever detonated. Just 16 years after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these hydrogen bombs have come to be 10,000 times more powerful. There have been vast advancements in science since the atomic bombings in Japan, a time frame of nearly 80 years. New developments in technology mean atomic bombs are more powerful today, much more powerful. Little Boy and Fat Man were around 15 kilotons each. Almost all modern nuclear bombs are above 100 kilotons, if not more. For visualization, the thermal blast from a 100 kiloton bomb would reach from Kensington to Shoreditch, essentially razing into the entirety of central London in an instant. And the most powerful hydrogen bombs in the worldwide arsenal are almost 1,000 times more powerful, so powerful that the thermal blast would encompass Bath, Oxford, and Birmingham all at once. Another important consideration is the current arsenal of warheads in possession by various world governments. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, around 21,000 operational warheads were at play in various parts of the world. Currently, that number is marginally lower at around 13,500. The number of active warheads in 1945, you may ask? 2. Just 2 fully operational warheads existed at the time, and both were used against Japan in hopes of bringing a decisive end to the war. However unlikely, in the event that even 10% of all active warheads are deployed, the collective payload would be 10,000 times larger than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Compared to 1945, when nuclear retaliation was out of the question, such an attack would immediately result in mutually assured destruction. It is difficult to decisively know what the end result of such a nuclear war would be in this day and age, nearly 80 years after such cruel bombs were last used in warfare. However, it is certain that the damage would be unimaginably widespread, and no argument of self-defense could possibly justify such worldwide devastation. It is therefore imperative that the past serve as a lesson, but not as a guidebook of what is to happen. We simply cannot know the extent of it. The debate today circles around many facts and analyses, but also the fundamental nature of human morality. Should lives be sacrificed to save many thousands more? Should this decision be solely in the hands of a select group of people around the world? In the event of nuclear war, is it better to go on the offensive or to minimize the damage? These aren't questions with easy answers where a formulaic approach to the associated human cost gives a straightforward result. They are instead questions that purely mask one's inner conscience, urging them to consider the supposed necessity of death. In my opinion, the very existence of the red button is a wholly unfortunate development of humanity, exploiting one of the fundamental laws of nature and physics to create something completely unnatural and completely unnatural levels of destruction and desolation. Therefore, I urge you to answer this motion with your conscience, learning from the past and recognizing the future, realizing the true implications of the red button, and vote to defeat this motion. Thank you very much.